In the mid-1970s, an unremarkable 15-year-old boy named Tommy Ziegler was looking out the third-story window of his history class at PA Capdo Junior High in New Orleans, Louisiana. He was never interested in history class, or any of his classes actually. He was more interested in myths, the paranormal, the dark arts, and in that subject he was well versed for his age, especially in the dark arts. He had collected in secret works of renowned Satanists like Aleister Crowley, Anton LaVey, Herbert Arthur Sloane, and others. He was part of a minor coven of teenagers that numbered 7 in all. To the others, it was more like an excuse to get high and tell creepy stories. But Tommy took it more seriously than the others, far more serious. It was the last day of class, and his weekend was only minutes away, and his unabated attention was focused out of the window at the old oak tree across the 4-lane avenue in front of the school. Just as the school bell rang, a red 1966 Chevy Impala slammed at high speed into the tree Tommy was devotedly fixated on. So Tommy, without the slightest hesitation, jumped from his desk and forced his way through the exiting mass of students eager to start the weekend's festivities. By the time he got past the doors of the school, 3 older people from the house behind the tree were already checking out the wreck. An old man tried to stop him, but Tommy just pushed him to the side. Then he got his first look at the already dead driver. The driver's side door was revealing a full view of the interior. The driver, a man looked like he was in his 50s perhaps, was pinned against the seat by the steering wheel with his arms on either side. His head was slung slightly back. His forehead had a large laceration going from one side to the other, and was open about 1/4 of an inch with blood flowing out. His jaw was broken to the point where it barely attached to the skull, and the rows of shattered bloody teeth were clearly visible. The blood was flowing rapidly down the slashed forehead, but somehow it was streaming around the eyes, down his cheeks. Then Tommy fixated on the driver's toupee. It was covered in blood and flung backwards, sticking horizontally in the air, just barely clinging to the back of his head. His eyes were open, and there was a tenderous black color with a white iris. Oddly enough, no one else seemed to have had noticed the man's eyes. His shoulders looked dislocated, and his chest was caved in. Tommy was oblivious to everything else going on around him. He was entranced on those eyes. By the time the principal of the school showed up, there was a large crowd of students and residents crowded around the wreck. Some people left immediately after the first glimpse of the macabre spectacle. The principal tried to tell the students in the crowd to get back and go home, but Tommy and a couple others just ignored him. They figured that outside of the school he had no authority to tell them anything. So while some of the students were arguing with the principal and grabbing the attention of the other onlookers, Tommy took the opportunity to gingerly touch the battered, bloody corpse. By now, the only part of the body that wasn't soaked in blood was the feet and the eyes. Tommy walked up to the body and softly touched both eyes. In an instant, he saw the image in his mind of an oak tree rapidly coming towards him and a loud roar of buckling metal. Suddenly, an overwhelming pain raged down his chest, and then he let out a deafening scream and fell to the ground. It only lasted a couple of seconds, then he found himself being pulled up by the arm. The principal helped him up to his feet. "You okay, son?" he asked Tommy. Tommy pulled away angrily. "Yeah, I'm fine. Get your queer hands off me." And as he turned, he noticed the eyes of the corpse were no longer black. He then forced his way through the crowd, knocking down a few people, including the principal, and ran to a small park about 3 blocks away called Anderton Memorial Park. It covered almost a city block and had about an acre of trees behind it. Tommy ran about halfway through and collapsed face first to the ground and fell unconscious. About an hour later, Tommy was awakened rather abruptly by 2 of his friends from his little pseudo-coven, Shawnee and Sid. They didn't go to Capto, so they didn't know about the accident. "Hey man, what you doing sleeping on the ground? You alright?" asked Sid, already high as hell. Tommy jumped to his feet in the wink of an eye and grabbed Sid by the throat, and with one arm raised him 2 feet off the ground. Tommy screamed at Shawnee, "Look at his eyes!" But before she could move, Tommy dropped him and stumbled backwards. As Sid gasped for breath, Tommy looked directly at Shawnee as she tried to help Sid. "What about his eyes?" she said. Sid looked at Tommy and saw his eyes were a bit glazed, but normal. "How in blazes did you do that?" screamed Sid, still struggling a little to breathe. "I don't know, man. It was like, I don't know." Sid pulled out the joint and they passed it around. Tommy told him about the accident. It was silent for a minute, then Shawnee put her hand on Tommy's shoulder. "It sounds like you might have been taken over by a demon or something." After Tommy, Shawnee was more intelligent than the rest of the group. Tommy stood up abruptly. "Let's call everybody and see what we could figure this shit out." Shawnee said she'd call anybody and they'd meet up at the shack about 8 o'clock. Now the shack was an old cinder block building on Sid's grandfather's property in New Orleans East. It was about 20 feet by 50 feet with only one window. It had 8 reclining chairs and a table. It also had a bookshelf with about 50 books of the occult. It was set about 80 yards behind his house, with his nearest neighbor being over half a block away. He was an eccentric old man and was pretty cool for an 80-year-old. Plus, he was well acquainted with the occult and drugs, and sometimes he would join us and tell us some of the supernatural folklore from Louisiana. He'd take a few hits of weed, but that was all. He was 80 after all. But he let them use the shack as long as the cops didn't come calling. Tommy, Shawnee, and Sid arrived at the shack about 8 o'clock. And then the others, David, Lisa, Tony, and Willie, stumbled in. It's about damn time you showed up, Tommy hollered. What's up with the hostility, dude? Asked Tommy. Sit down and I'll tell you. Just as he was about to tell him, the door opened and said grandfather walk in. Things aren't well with you, my boy, he said, looking directly at Tommy. I can sense a defilement concealed within your ghost. Tommy looked at him puzzled. My ghost? The old man sat on the remaining chair and lit his hash pipe. Yes, my boy, your ghost. Everyone has a ghost within him. It's inside you in life, and in death, it's set free to wander into the afterlife. Or not. Sid looked at his grandfather with his eyes bugging out. How do you know that? He asked. Well, Sid, my boy, I've been a mancer since the late 40s. A what? Sid asked. Shawnee chimed in. A necromancer. A magician. That's correct, young lady, but I haven't practiced magic in years. Too many consequences. And temptations. He passed the puzzled Sid the pipe. I never told you, Sid, because, well, to be honest, you're not the sharpest knife in the drawer. Then he looked at Tommy. So tell me your woes, my boy. After Tommy explained to them about the wreck and the dead driver, they all looked at him with glassy eyes and gaping jaws. Sid's granddad looked at him intently. Black eyes and white irises, you say? Yes. He rubbed his eyes distressingly. It sounds like a hag born, he said. In the 1700s, before New Orleans became a port, there was a coven of white witches from France just outside what you know as New Orleans East, around here. A witch was walking in the forest when she was defiled by a vile godling. A god, as it was told, a very minor one at that. It was said when she realized she was with child, she tried to abort it by drinking a concoction of hellebore and pennyroyal leaves. The fetus reacted violently, releasing a venom that took over her mind, rendering her almost catatonic and making her an adult minion. The high priestess felt the only way to stop the monstrosity from being born was to take her witch sister's life. With the consent of the coven and the witch herself, it was brought to a small clearing and burned the triquetra in the grass and laid her upon it. As the coven chanted, the priestess raised a pine guard dagger above her head and plunged it into her sister's heart. The witch didn't cry out, but an agonizing scream sounded like it was coming from her belly. With that, they reluctantly burned her body to be rid of the vile creature inside her. Then the old man leaned back in his chair and relit his pipe. The shack was silent for a few minutes. Everyone was waiting for him to say something, but he didn't. Tommy then spoke out abruptly. If it was burned, how could it have survived? Even an unborn, half-human, half-demigod has its ghosts. Some things the sisters seem to have missed. Sid's grandfather took one more puff from his pipe, and he stood up and looked at all of them. Well, I guess it's time we hit the books.